Most people believe they understand who Patrick Swayze was. They remember the confident lift in Dirty Dancing, the tenderness in Ghost, the physical certainty of a man who seemed carved from discipline and rhythm. He was the embodiment of control, a performer whose body obeyed him completely, whose presence filled a room without effort. From the outside, his life appeared orderly, successful, even charmed. What the audience never saw was how fragile that control truly was, or how quickly it could be taken away without warning. The final chapter of his life did not begin with a dramatic collapse or a public announcement. It began quietly, almost invisibly, with discomfort that was easy to dismiss. A dull pain in the abdomen, fatigue that could be blamed on work, restless nights that came and went. For a man conditioned to endure physical strain, nothing about it felt urgent. He had spent his entire life pushing through pain, ignoring signals that told him to slow down. This was simply another one of those moments, or so he believed. But the body, once it decides to speak clearly, does not negotiate. The tests escalated. Scans replaced assumptions. Doctors stopped using cautious language. The diagnosis arrived without ceremony, but with devastating precision. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. Metastasis to the liver. Prognosis measured not in years, but in months. It was the kind of sentence that instantly divides a life into before and after, stripping away future plans and replacing them with silence. For many, that moment becomes an ending. For Patrick, it became a confrontation. He did not ask why this was happening to him, and he did not ask how much time he had left. Instead, he asked what could be done, not out of denial, but out of instinct. Control had always been his anchor, and even as his body began slipping beyond his command, his mind refused to surrender that role. He was not searching for a miracle. He was searching for agency. Those closest to him noticed the shift immediately. The fear was there, unspoken but undeniable, yet it never surfaced as panic. It manifested as discipline. Appointments were kept. Research was pursued. Options were evaluated with the same focus he once applied to choreography and rehearsal. When an experimental clinical trial presented itself, uncertain and unapproved, he accepted without hesitation. Not because it promised survival, but because it offered something active to hold on to. What followed was a strange and painful contradiction. As his diagnosis became known, the world began preparing to say goodbye, while Patrick quietly refused to step away from life. He returned to work, not as a public statement, but as a personal necessity. Acting had always been more than a career to him. It was structure. It was purpose. It was proof that he was still present in the world. On set, he was not a terminal patient. He was simply an actor doing his job. The physical toll was immense. Treatments drained his energy. Nausea lingered. Pain became a constant companion. Yet he did not allow those realities to define the way he moved through his days. He arrived prepared. He learned his lines. He refused shortcuts. When offered accommodations, he declined them gently but firmly. The disease was already taking enough. He would not allow it to take his dignity as well. Behind the scenes, however, the effort was visible. There were moments of exhaustion that no performance could mask. Moments when the body trembled, when the mirror reflected a version of himself he barely recognized. For a man whose identity had always been rooted in physical strength and precision, the gradual erosion was deeply personal. Hair thinning, weight dropping, movements slowing. Each change felt like a quiet theft. And yet, there was no bitterness in him, no public resentment, no dramatic confessions. He carried himself with the same calm restraint that had defined him long before illness entered his life. Those who watched closely understood that this was not denial. It was choice. He chose how he would be seen. He chose how he would live. Even as time began tightening around him, he refused to let fear dictate the terms. This is where the Real story begins, not with the diagnosis itself, but with the way he stood in its shadow. Not loudly, not heroically, but deliberately. A man who understood that he could not outrun what was coming, yet still insisted on walking forward with purpose. In the quiet space between strength and surrender, Patrick Swayze began writing the final, most human performance of his life. Long before the world learned to associate his name with romance and cinematic intensity, Patrick Swayze was shaped by a far less forgiving environment. He grew up in Houston, Texas, a place where toughness was not a metaphor but a daily requirement. His childhood was defined by contrast. His mother, a choreographer and dance instructor, demanded precision, discipline, and emotional expression through movement. His father embodied a quieter, more traditional strength, grounded, restrained, and deeply Texan. Between those two forces, Patrick learned early that vulnerability and resilience were not opposites. They were partners. Dance entered his life not as a hobby, but as a system of control. It taught him how to listen to his body, how to push it, and how to suffer in silence when necessary. Ballet was unforgiving, and so was his training. Injuries were frequent. Pain was normalized. Quitting was not an option. That mentality would follow him everywhere, long after the studios and mirrors of his youth faded into memory. Even when he later embraced acting, he approached it with the same physical seriousness, treating each role as something that had to be inhabited fully, not simply performed. Hollywood noticed him because he did not fit neatly into its expectations. He was not soft enough to be dismissed as a dancer, and not rigid enough to be boxed into a single masculine archetype. There was grace in the way he moved, but also danger in the way he stood still. That contradiction became his signature. When his breakthrough arrived, it did not feel accidental. It felt earned through years of rejection, understudy roles, and quiet persistence that never made headlines. Success, however, did not bring him peace. Fame amplified pressure rather than relieving it. With each new role came the unspoken demand to maintain an image that no human body could preserve indefinitely. He trained harder, worked longer hours, and refused assistance that might have slowed him down. His body, once an ally, became something he had to constantly negotiate with. Injuries accumulated. Surgeries followed. Painkillers entered the picture, first as tools, then as quiet liabilities. There was a period when control slipped. Addiction crept in not as chaos, but as routine. He did not implode publicly. There were no scandals splashed across tabloids. Instead, his struggle unfolded in private, marked by denial, relapse, and eventual reckoning. When he entered rehabilitation, he did so without spectacle, confronting the reality that discipline alone could not solve everything. Recovery was not linear, and he never pretended that it was. What mattered to him was accountability, not image repair. Alongside these internal battles was a personal life shaped by endurance rather than perfection. His relationship with Lisa was not a fairy tale preserved behind closed doors. It endured distance, tension, and periods of emotional separation. Careers pulled them in different directions. Misunderstandings lingered longer than either would admit. Yet something fundamental always pulled them back together. They had met young, before ambition and expectation complicated everything, and that shared history anchored them in moments when the present felt unstable. Loss also carved deep grooves into his life. The death of his father left a wound that never fully healed, reinforcing Patrick's belief that strength often meant continuing without closure. Later, the miscarriage he and Lisa experienced became a silent grief, rarely spoken about, but deeply felt. It reshaped how he viewed family, legacy, and the things that truly mattered once the applause faded. These experiences did not make him softer in the way people expect. They made him quieter, more inward, more aware of how fragile everything truly was. Professionally, he remained relentless. Even as trends shifted and younger faces dominated the screen, he refused to coast on past success. He sought roles that demanded emotional exposure, characters that carried moral weight rather than simple charm. There was an urgency in his choices, as if he understood long before his diagnosis that time was not an infinite resource. Colleagues often described him as serious on set, focused to the point of intensity, but never cruel. He expected commitment because he gave nothing less himself. By the time illness entered his life, this foundation was already firmly set. He was a man conditioned to endure, to adapt, to carry pain without display. The diagnosis did not create a fighter. It revealed one that had been shaped quietly over decades. His refusal to surrender was not bravado. It was habit. He had spent his entire life responding to adversity by leaning forward, not stepping back. What made this period especially complex was that Patrick had already faced versions of loss before. He had lost physical certainty through injury. He had lost control through addiction. He had lost futures he once imagined through personal tragedy. Cancer was not an isolated event. It was another chapter in a life defined by confrontation with limits. The difference was that this time, the limit was absolute. Yet even then, he did not frame his story as tragic. He did not allow himself to be reduced to a cautionary tale or a symbol of suffering. He continued to speak about work, about horses, about ordinary routines that grounded him. Normalcy became a form of resistance. In choosing to live as fully as circumstances allowed, he quietly rejected the narrative that terminal illness erases identity. This deeper context matters because it reframes everything that followed. His later choices were not impulsive acts of denial, but consistent expressions of who he had always been. A man shaped by discipline, scarred by loss, loyal to love, and unwilling to define himself by fear. When the world later watched his body weaken, what they were truly witnessing was not decline, but the final test of a life spent mastering endurance. The moment illness stopped being theoretical and began asserting itself day by day, Patrick Swayze found himself standing at the intersection of will and reality. The early optimism surrounding experimental treatment did not erase the truth of what was happening inside his body. It only delayed the reckoning. Each scan carried its own quiet tension. Each result in negotiation between hope and restraint. Some days brought cautious relief. Others delivered silence heavy enough to fill the room. Nothing was ever certain, and that uncertainty became the new rhythm of his life. As treatment continued, the side effects accumulated in ways that could no longer be hidden from those closest to him. Fatigue was no longer occasional. It was constant, settling into his bones, slowing movements that once defined him. Nausea arrived without warning. Pain sharpened, then dulled, then returned with different timing, forcing him to recalibrate every hour. Still, he refused to let the disease dictate his public presence. When he spoke to others, he downplayed symptoms, redirecting conversations toward work or plans that existed just far enough in the future to feel real. Returning to the set of The Beast was not a symbolic gesture. It was an act of defiance grounded in routine. The production environment was unforgiving even for healthy actors, and Patrick knew this. Long shooting days, physical scenes, and emotional intensity left little room for weakness. Yet he showed up every morning prepared, often earlier than required, carrying himself with a discipline that unsettled those who knew what he was enduring. Insurance representatives worried. Executives hesitated. None of that mattered to him. Work was not an escape. It was structure, and structure was survival. Behind the camera, however, the strain was undeniable. Between takes, he sometimes retreated into silence, conserving energy as if it were currency. Crew members noticed how he leaned against walls a little longer than necessary, how he closed his eyes between setups, how his breathing changed after scenes that once would not have taxed him at all. When pain surged, he disappeared briefly, only to return moments later composed, ready, unwilling to acknowledge what had just passed through him. There were moments when the performance slipped, not in his acting, but in the cracks between scenes. A friend once found him alone in his trailer, body folded inward, sweat soaking through his clothes, hands trembling uncontrollably. He did not ask for help in the way people expect. He did not speak about fear or injustice. He simply asked for a hand to hold. That request carried more weight than any dramatic confession could have. It revealed the cost of his resolve, the quiet toll exacted by maintaining control in a situation where control was steadily eroding. As filming progressed, the disease advanced in less visible but more consequential ways. Weight loss accelerated. His face sharpened, cheekbones more pronounced, eyes darker, more distant. Hair thinned, then fell away, a change that struck him harder than he anticipated. It was not vanity that troubled him, but symbolism. Hair loss made the illness visible in a way that strength and discipline could not mask. To preserve some sense of normalcy, he wore wigs in public, not to deceive, but to delay conversations he was not ready to have. Chemotherapy intensified. Doctors proposed new combinations, more aggressive approaches that carried heavier risks. Each decision came with trade-offs measured not just in side effects, but in clarity of mind. Patrick resisted sedation whenever possible. He wanted to remain present, to experience his life fully, even if that meant enduring discomfort others might have chosen to dull. Pain medication became necessary, but he treated it carefully, wary of losing himself to relief. Hospitalizations became more frequent. A bout of pneumonia marked a turning point, exposing just how compromised his immune system had become. This time, cameras followed. Photographs emerged showing a version of him the public was unprepared to see. Frail, supported by oxygen, stripped of the physical authority that had once defined him. The images traveled fast, and with them came speculation, pity, and an unspoken acknowledgement that the end was no longer abstract. Yet even then, his instinct was not retreat. He spoke with doctors about next steps, about treatment options that existed more in theory than practice. An experimental combination of drugs was proposed, one that carried significant toxicity with uncertain benefit. He agreed immediately. Risk had never frightened him as much as an action. Each additional month was not viewed as borrowed time, but as earned time. Outside the hospital, life narrowed. Social circles shrank. Conversations shortened. Energy became something that had to be rationed carefully. Simple tasks demanded recovery periods. Still, he tried to maintain routines that connected him to the person he had always been. He watched films. He talked about future roles, not because he believed he would play them, but because imagining them kept him oriented toward life rather than decline. Eventually, even that became difficult. Speech slowed. Concentration wavered. Moments of confusion appeared, brief but alarming. The cancer was no longer contained. It had spread quietly, invading systems that governed balance, memory, and endurance. His body, once responsive and obedient, now resisted him at every turn. The decision to leave the hospital and return home was not framed as surrender. It was framed as choice. Home represented autonomy, familiarity, and peace that sterile rooms could not offer. The ranch, with its open land and horses, had always been a place where he felt aligned with himself. There, the world moved at a pace that did not demand explanations. There, he could exist without performance. At home, the reality of his condition became impossible to ignore. Muscle loss was severe. Standing required effort. Mounting a horse was no longer feasible. Often, he stood at the fence instead, watching them move, absorbing the quiet strength they embodied. Lisa assumed the role of caretaker without hesitation, managing medications, meals, and pain with meticulous attention. Their relationship shifted into something deeper, less romantic in the conventional sense, but more intimate than anything they had known before. The media, sensing proximity to an ending, circled relentlessly. Photographs captured fragments but missed the essence. They documented deterioration, not devotion. They recorded weakness, not resolve. Inside the house, conversations became simpler, more essential. There was less need for explanation, more reliance on presence. Words lost importance. Touch replaced language. As summer progressed, it became clear that the long resistance was nearing its limit. Fevers lingered. Tremors increased. Blood work revealed systems shutting down in quiet succession. When doctors finally acknowledged that no further interventions would change the outcome, the truth arrived without drama. There are no speeches, no anger, no bargaining, only recognition. What defined this period was not despair, but clarity. Patrick understood what was happening. He did not romanticize it. He did not seek meaning in suffering. He focused instead on the people and moments still within reach. His world contracted, but it did not empty. In those final weeks, strength no longer roared. It whispered, sustained by presence, dignity, and a refusal to let fear write the final lines. As the disease tightened its grip, the consequences rippled outward, touching every corner of Patrick Swayze's life and the lives of those orbiting him. What had once been a private struggle gradually became a shared burden, reshaping relationships, routines, and expectations in ways no one could fully prepare for. The man who had spent decades projecting certainty now lived in a state where even simple plans carried contingency. Time was no longer measured in weeks or months, but in moments of energy and clarity that appeared without warning and vanished just as quickly. For those closest to him, the emotional toll was relentless. Watching a body fail is one thing. Watching a will remain intact while the body refuses to follow is something else entirely. Friends described a constant tension between admiration and grief. They were inspired by his refusal to collapse inward, yet haunted by the visible cost of that resistance. Conversations shifted subtly. Laughter still existed, but it was quieter, more deliberate, as if everyone understood it had become a finite resource. Professionally, the impact was immediate and unavoidable. Projects that once would have welcomed his involvement now hesitated, not out of disregard, but out of fear. Studios worried about schedules. Insurers calculated risks. The industry that had once celebrated his endurance now confronted its own limitations. And yet, his final performances carried a gravity that transcended logistics. Those who worked with him during this period later reflected that his presence on set altered the atmosphere entirely. Scenes felt heavier, more intentional, as if everyone understood they were witnessing something unrepeatable. Public reaction followed a familiar pattern. Sympathy mixed with speculation. Admiration competed with discomfort. Audiences accustomed to seeing him as a symbol of vitality struggled to reconcile that image with the reality of illness. Media coverage oscillated between respectful distance and invasive curiosity. Every photograph became evidence, every appearance a point of analysis. In that environment, privacy became both precious and fragile. The strain extended into his home in ways that rarely reach headlines. Daily life became a careful choreography of medications, rest, and vigilance. Nights were often the hardest. Pain flared unpredictably, disrupting sleep and eroding strength. Lisa adjusted constantly, learning when to intervene and when to simply remain present. Caregiving blurred the line between partner and protector, demanding emotional stamina that few outsiders ever fully grasp. There were losses that did not announce themselves dramatically. Independence faded first. Tasks once completed without thought now required assistance. Choices narrowed. Even small pleasures had to be weighed against exhaustion. These changes accumulated quietly, reshaping identity piece by piece. For a man whose sense of self had long been anchored in physical competence, the erosion was profound. Yet he rarely spoke about it directly. Acknowledging loss did not come easily to someone who had spent a lifetime pushing forward. The broader social impact was equally complex. Fans reached out with letters filled with gratitude and grief, projecting their own stories onto his struggle. Many found motivation in his persistence, interpreting his endurance as a lesson in courage. Others felt discomfort, confronted with the reminder that fame offers no immunity. Patrick absorbed these responses with characteristic restraint. He never positioned himself as a symbol. He simply continued living within the limits he was given. As the months passed, the cumulative effects of illness began to overshadow even the strongest moments of resolve. Fatigue deepened into weakness that no amount of discipline could override. Concentration fractured. Emotional regulation became harder, not because of despair, but because the body no longer supported sustained effort. Even so, there was an underlying steadiness in him that did not disappear. Those who spent time with him noticed that while his energy waned, his attention sharpened. He listened more than he spoke. He chose words carefully when he did. The impact on Lisa was profound and unrelenting. She navigated a world that expected strength while offering little refuge. Public narratives simplified her role, reducing it to stereotypes that ignored the complexity of what she was carrying. In private, she bore witness to every shift in his condition, every incremental loss, every fleeting moment of relief. Care became an act of love stripped of illusion, grounded in consistency rather than sentiment. Outside the house, life continued in a way that felt almost surreal. The world did not pause. News cycles moved on. Projects advanced without him. That contrast underscored one of the most difficult truths of serious illness. Suffering feels singular to those inside it, but peripheral to everyone else. Patrick understood this instinctively. He never resented it. He had spent his life aware of impermanence, even when success suggested otherwise. As physical decline accelerated, the long-term consequences crystallized. There would be no return to former strength, no late resurgence. The horizon narrowed decisively. Acceptance did not arrive as a single moment of clarity, but as a gradual alignment between expectation and reality. He stopped speaking about distant possibilities and focused instead on the immediacy of being present. That shift did not erase sadness, but it softened its edges. In this phase, the true cost of the illness became unmistakable. It was not only the loss of years, but the compression of identity, the forced shedding of roles, the confrontation with dependency. And yet, even here, Patrick retained something essential. A quiet dignity that did not demand recognition. A composure that acknowledged pain without being consumed by it. The people around him adjusted in response, learning how to support without intruding, how to grieve without rushing ahead of him. The atmosphere grew heavier, but also more honest. Pretenses fell away. What remained was connection, stripped to its core. This period did not define him by suffering alone. It revealed the consequences of a life lived intensely, the price of endurance, and the weight carried by those who choose to stand their ground until standing is no longer possible. In a narrowing space between presence and absence, the impact of his journey became undeniable, not as a spectacle, but as a deeply human reckoning. There were stories that never reached the public, moments that unfolded far from cameras and headlines, where Patrick Swayze existed not as an icon or a patient, but simply as a man navigating the slow unraveling of his body. These moments were small, almost invisible, yet they carried the heaviest weight. They lived in quiet mornings when sunlight filtered through windows and he lay awake long before anyone else, listening to the house breathe, gauging whether the day would grant him strength or demand surrender. He developed rituals without ever naming them. A cup of tea held carefully between weakened hands. A few minutes spent sitting upright before attempting to stand. Pauses between movements that once flowed effortlessly. These were not acts of resignation, but adaptations, subtle recalibrations that allowed him to preserve dignity in a body that no longer obeyed commands. He measured success differently now, standing without assistance, eating without nausea, staying present through a full conversation. Friends who visited noticed the shift immediately. The bravado was gone, but something steadier had taken its place. Patrick spoke less about fighting and more about noticing. The way the air felt cooler in the evenings. The comfort of familiar music playing softly in the background. The presence of animals moving calmly through the land. He did not frame these observations as revelations. He mentioned them casually, as if acknowledging details he had always overlooked while moving too fast. There were nights when pain refused to be managed completely. Even with medication carefully adjusted, discomfort seeped through, forcing him into long stretches of wakefulness. During those hours, Lisa often sat nearby without speaking, understanding that words would only complicate what was already difficult. Sometimes he reached for her hand. Sometimes he did not. The silence between them was not empty. It carried decades of shared history, arguments long resolved, grief long integrated, love no longer in need of explanation. Occasionally, he allowed fragments of vulnerability to surface. Not fear of dying, but fear of disappearing before certain things had been said. He worried about unfinished conversations, about how he would be remembered not by fans, but by those who knew him privately. These thoughts emerged briefly, then receded, as if he were careful not to let them dominate the space. He had never been someone who lingered in introspection for its own sake. There were also moments of humor, unexpectedly sharp and dry. Even as his energy faded, his wit remained intact. He made understated remarks about his condition, never cruel, never self-pitying, just honest enough to break the tension. Laughter, when it came, felt earned. It reminded everyone in the room that he was still himself, altered but not erased. The horses remained a quiet presence. He no longer rode them, but he watched them often, leaning against fences or sitting nearby while they moved freely across the land. There was something grounding in their indifference to his illness. They did not pity him. They did not adjust their behavior. They simply existed, offering a form of companionship that required nothing in return. He once remarked that they reminded him how life continues without commentary, without meaning assigned to it. Visitors sometimes expected profound statements, final reflections distilled into quotable lines. They were often surprised to find none. Patrick did not feel compelled to summarize his life or extract lessons from his suffering. He resisted the impulse to turn his experience into narrative closure. Instead, he spoke about ordinary things, weather patterns, films he enjoyed, people he missed. This refusal to perform, even in decline, was consistent with how he had lived all along. As his condition worsened, the boundaries of his world narrowed further. Days blurred together. Energy arrived unpredictably, sometimes enough to sit outside for a while, sometimes barely enough to remain awake. Yet within that contraction, there was a strange sense of clarity. He stopped anticipating what came next and focused instead on what was immediately present. Meals became events. Conversations became deliberate. Rest was no longer optional, but essential. Lisa's role deepened into something almost wordless. She learned to read subtle changes in his breathing, the tension in his jaw, the way his eyes shifted when pain intensified. Care became intuitive, shaped by observation rather than instruction. She adjusted medication schedules, managed appointments, and shielded him from unnecessary stress, all while navigating her own private grief. There was no rehearsal for this kind of intimacy. It emerged from necessity and devotion intertwined. Outside, rumors and speculation continued, but they felt distant, irrelevant to the reality unfolding inside the house. The world imagined drama. What existed instead was endurance expressed quietly. There were no grand gestures, no stage farewells. Just consistency, presence. The slow, deliberate choice to remain connected to life as long as possible. In the rare moments when clarity sharpened, Patrick acknowledged what was happening without bitterness. He did not frame it as injustice. He did not search for cosmic explanations. He accepted the limits of what could be changed and focused his energy on what remained within reach. That acceptance was not passive. It was active, practiced daily through restraint and attention. These unseen chapters, the ones that unfolded away from public narrative, revealed a version of Patrick that few had ever known. Not the dancer, not the actor, not the symbol of resilience, but a man learning how to let go without collapsing inward. In those quiet spaces, stripped of performance and expectation, The essence of who he was became unmistakable. Steady, observant, present. It was here, in the absence of spectacle, that his humanity spoke most clearly, not through declarations of courage, but through the simple act of staying engaged with life, even as its edges closed in. The story of these moments was never meant for an audience, yet they formed the emotional core of everything that followed, shaping the final days with a depth that no headline could capture. When people later try to define what Patrick Swayze left behind, they often reached first for his films, his awards, the moments that once filled theaters with applause. Those were the visible markers, easy to list, easy to celebrate. What proved harder to articulate was the quieter legacy that emerged only after the noise fell away, when his final months were viewed not as spectacle, but as a study in how a person lives when certainty is stripped down to its barest form. His endurance was never about conquering illness. It was about refusing to let illness become the sole author of his identity. Even as his body weakened, he maintained a clarity about who he was and what mattered to him. Work had once been his structure, then presence became his anchor. That evolution revealed something essential. Strength, for him, was never fixed. It adapted. When physical mastery was no longer possible, attentiveness replaced it. When action was limited, intention remained. Those who reflected on his final years often spoke about his mindset. Not optimism in the simplistic sense, but orientation. He did not deny reality. He acknowledged it fully, then chose how to respond. That choice did not erase pain or fear, but gave them boundaries. He did not allow suffering to consume the entirety of his inner life. Instead, he focused on what could still be shaped. Conversations, relationships, moments of ordinary connection that resisted the gravity of decline. This approach left a deep impression on those around him. Doctors noted his unusual engagement, his willingness to participate actively in decisions without illusion. Nurses remembered his courtesy, even during moments of intense discomfort. Friends carried with them the memory of someone who remained present, even when presence demanded effort few could imagine. His behavior did not dramatize resilience. It normalized it. In hindsight, it became clear that his earlier life had prepared him for this final reckoning in ways that were never intentional, but deeply consequential. Years of discipline had taught him how to endure without complaint. Experiences of loss had shown him that grief does not invalidate meaning. Recovery from addiction had instilled humility, an understanding that control is something negotiated daily rather than assumed. These threads converged quietly as he faced the last stretch of his life. There was also a broader cultural resonance that emerged gradually. In a world that often celebrates youth, speed, and invincibility, Patrick's final chapter offered a different image, one that acknowledged limitation without equating it to failure. He did not present dying as noble or beautiful. He presented living, even at the edge, as something still worthy of care and attention. That distinction mattered to those watching closely. For many fans, his story reframed their relationship with his work. Scenes once remembered for romance or physicality took on new dimensions when viewed through the lens of what he endured later. His performances became echoes of a larger truth, that vulnerability and strength were never separate in him. They had always coexisted, waiting to be recognized. Perhaps the most enduring aspect of his legacy was the way he modeled loyalty, not in dramatic declarations, but in consistency. Loyalty to his partner, expressed through trust and shared presence. Loyalty to his craft, maintained even when the cost was high. Loyalty to himself, evident in his refusal to perform despair for public consumption. These choices did not draw attention at the time, but they accumulated meaning long after. As conversations turned toward what his life represented, there was a temptation to extract lessons, to frame his journey as a roadmap for others facing illness or loss. He would have resisted that impulse. His life was not a prescription. It was an example of one person responding authentically to circumstances he did not choose. The value lay not in imitation, but in recognition. Recognition that dignity can exist alongside dependence. That courage does not always announce itself. That presence can be an achievement in itself. In the end, his story did not resolve into triumph or tragedy alone. It settled into something more nuanced. A reminder that legacies are not built solely in moments of success, but also in how one navigates decline. That what remains after a life ends is shaped as much by restraint as by ambition. By the willingness to face reality without surrendering humanity. Patrick did not leave behind a philosophy or a manifesto. He left behind an example of attention, of steadiness, of choosing engagement over withdrawal, even when options narrowed. For those who witnessed it directly or from a distance, that example lingered quietly, offering a different metric for measuring a life well lived. In the final days, when the margins of consciousness grew thin, Patrick Swayze no longer needed to explain himself to anyone. The long struggle had distilled life to its simplest elements: breath, touch, presence. The urgency that once defined his days softened into something quieter, almost suspended, as if time itself had learned to slow its pace in his company. What remained was not drama, but stillness, and within that stillness, a clarity that did not require words. Those closest to him noticed how little resistance he carried at the end, not because he had lost his will, but because the fight had completed its purpose. He had stayed engaged for as long as engagement was possible. Now, effort shifted inward, focused on comfort and connection rather than endurance. Pain was managed carefully, awareness guarded when possible. He wanted to remain himself, even as the boundaries of selfhood began to blur. The house grew quieter. Conversations shortened. Long pauses filled the spaces where plans once lived. Lisa stayed near him, not out of obligation, but instinct. There was no need to revisit the past or rehearse meaning. Their shared history was already present in the room, carried in gestures and glances that required no translation. When words did surface, they were simple and unembellished. Love expressed without performance. Gratitude implied rather than declared. In those hours, there was no attempt to turn the moment into a legacy statement. No final lesson offered to the world. Patrick had never believed that dying needed an audience, and he remained consistent to the end. What mattered was not how the moment would be remembered, but how it was lived. Quietly, honestly, without fear masquerading as bravery. When the final breath came, it arrived without spectacle. No dramatic crescendo, just a gradual letting go, a body finally allowed to rest after months of relentless negotiation. Those present understood immediately. There was sadness, of course, but also a strange sense of completion. The story had not been cut short. It had reached its natural end. Afterward, silence settled in ways that felt heavier than grief itself. The absence was palpable, not because something extraordinary had vanished, but because something deeply familiar was no longer there. Life outside continued unchanged, indifferent to the loss, while inside, everything felt rearranged. The world did not pause, and yet for those who loved him, time seemed briefly misaligned. In the days that followed, public narratives rushed to fill the void. Headlines attempted to summarize a life in fragments. Rumors surfaced, as they often do when clarity threatened speculation. Yet those who had been present knew the truth required no defense. What had unfolded was not neglect or conflict, but devotion carried quietly through exhaustion and uncertainty. The noise faded eventually, leaving behind what had always mattered most. What endures now is not a myth of invincibility, nor a romanticized portrait of suffering. It is the memory of a man who remained engaged with life until engagement was no longer possible, who chose presence over retreat, who allowed love to be practical rather than performative. His legacy does not demand admiration. It invites reflection. When people return to his films, they may notice different things now. A glance held a moment longer. a vulnerability once overlooked, a depth beneath the surface that mirrors the man he became when everything unnecessary fell away. His work remains, but it is the way he lived when the work was done that lingers most strongly. There is something quietly instructive in that. Not a command to be fearless or unyielding, but a reminder that dignity is not measured by control alone, that strength can exist alongside dependence, that a life does not lose meaning when it narrows. Sometimes, meaning becomes clearer precisely because the margins disappear. As the story closes, what remains is not an answer, but a question left gently in the air. How do we choose to show up when certainty is gone? How do we remain ourselves when roles fall away? Patrick's final chapter does not offer resolution in the traditional sense. It offers presence. And perhaps that is enough. If his journey moved you, if a moment or a performance stays with you differently now, share it. Not to commemorate an ending, but to acknowledge the quiet power of a life lived with intention all the way to its last breath.